Sure. So it is a history of the Black Sea, which sounds like a strange idea because, how could you write a history of the sea? And that was in part one of my goals, which was to put our historical gaze, if you like, kind of right in the middle of the sea. So imagine you're on a ship in the middle of the sea and you're kind of looking out on the regions around it and reimagining how you would tell the story of that entire area from a point somewhere in the middle of the sea. Because what we typically do is put ourselves in some national capital and then tell a story from there. It's what I call the landlubber bias in history writing. And that gives us a sort of strange... Well, first of all, it tells us what the end point of history should be, and the end point is national unity. National unity in the creation of an independent state, and that's the sort of point that we're going toward. It also tends to emphasize national history as opposed to other versions of history. It tends to subsume individual, family, group, community, town, river, sea experience into one story about the nation. And that's particularly true, I think, in Eastern Europe and Eurasia, where the dominant, in most history writing and most history teaching, the dominant unit is the nation, the ethnically defined, culturally defined nation. Whereas for most of human history, and in fact, I would even say today, people don't experience history as the member of a nation. They experience history as a member of a family or somebody who lives on this street or someone who is in some other kind of category that's meaningful to the state. But they don't really experience it as nation. They learn to tell it. They learn it in school as national history. That's a story that's not what really human experience most of the time is about. And so I wanted to use the sea as a lever, if you like, against that dominant way of telling history, just to see, well, what would history be like if we told it from a literally different vantage point. And so it begins in antiquity. In fact, it begins with a little bit of environmental history, although I'm not an environmental history expert, but it begins with environment, and then comes up all the way to the 1990s and the turn of the millennium, and tries to give a broad, overarching sweep of history while also telling some stories about individual people and communities who have made an impact on the region. It's not entirely clear. The answer is it's not entirely clear. But it most likely is a translation of a much older, probably originally Greek word, Pontos Axenos, which was so far as we can tell, one of the original names of the place, which means simply dark or foreboding sea. And that could be something all the way from watercolor, given the great depths of the sea and the frequent storms and the cloudiness and so forth. It could be that's where when Mediterranean sailors made their way into this body of water at some point before the 5th century BC, they gave it that name as a way of reflecting the physical appearance of the sea as they found it. And then most of the cultures around the sea simply adopted some version of that name in their own language. Interestingly enough, the Greeks eventually changed the name. So rather than dark or foreboding sea, the name that in later Greek sources it's known by is Pontos Euxenos, which means literally the sea that's welcoming, or the sea that's welcoming to strangers. And then if you read the poetry of Lord Byron or romantic English poetry from the 19th century, they will often refer to it by the English version of that second Greek name. So the word Euxine, Euxine, is the kind of romantic English equivalent of that Pontos Euxenos word that the Greeks use. So it gets very, very confusing, but most of the cultures, most of the languages around the sea use some version of the word Black Sea to describe it. one thing I wanted to do was not tell the history of the Black Sea as a segmented history of multiple countries around it, right? Because, of course, the borders that define countries are in the long stretch of human history relatively recent. The countries themselves in the long stretch of human history are relatively recent. And so the history does bounce around from the multiple shores of the Black Sea, but I never really tell the story in terms of this is what the Turks did or the Bulgarians did or what Turkey or Bulgaria did. And in fact, we can kind of see that right now. So we can count up the internationally recognized countries around the Black Sea, but then we immediately begin sort of coming into some problems. So, Georgia borders the Black Sea, but do we count Abkhazia or not, which is also a country recognized at least by Russia as independent, but not really by much of anyone else? How do we think about the political status of Crimea in the contemporary period? Moldova does not border the Black Sea, but it kind of borders the Danube. So is it in a very, very tiny stretch of territory? So is it a Black Sea power as well? And then if you magnify those very current questions on the long stretch of human history, you get a sense of the degree to which telling the history of this body of water through the prism of politics in any one era could really be a recipe for confusion. So I try to avoid that and really try to get at how did people, communities, interact with the sea, and how did that change over time? So, well, imagine all of the other things that really affected the way people lived in this part of the world besides something called a nation state. So the great migrations of fish around the Black Sea, the seasonal migration of anchovies, which was a far, far bigger deal for millennia in the life of people than who was president or prime minister of some country that they were allegedly a part of. So I tell that story. The opening up of the massive intercontinental and intersea trade routes by the Middle Ages that allowed people to go all the way from China, from China to Central Europe to the Mediterranean, trading spices and silk and so forth for about 300 years. That depended on a thing called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace across Central Asia, that in Russian history is usually called the Mongol yoke. This time of oppression and occupation by the Mongols, but it was the thing, that period of relative peace for about 300 years, that allowed trade goods to move across Central Asia relatively easily in Europe, across the Black Sea, across the Mediterranean. In fact, at the beginning of the 13th century, when Marco Polo, according to his own account, travels from Italy to China and back, if you read Marco Polo's travels, he has this magnificent, regardless of whether you think he actually did all of the things he claimed to have done, there is a remarkable little piece of evidence in his travels, which is, he says he traveled all the way from Trabzon on the north coast, what is now the north coast of Turkey, on the Black Sea, to what is today Istanbul or Constantinople. He has precisely one paragraph on that journey, and that would have taken many days, perhaps weeks, as he was bouncing around the coast, trading goods and meeting with people and so on. He says, I'm going to tell you what I found there because everybody already knows, meaning that his readers in the 13th century in Italy were so familiar with the piece of territory that now defines the entire southern coast of the Black Sea that he thought it would be redundant to tell you anything about it. So Genoese, Florentines, Venetians were so widespread in that part of the world that we've forgotten that, the time when the Black Sea was very much an Italian lake, not a Turkish lake or a Russian lake or what have you, but an Italian lake. And so I'm trying to bring up much more of these forgotten elements of the past of this body of water that has a far longer history than the contemporary nation states around it. In fact, most of the ancient accounts of what's called a periplus, that is a sail around something. There are many periply of the Mediterranean. There are several periply of the Black Sea where we have an ancient text that tells us about somebody's voyage around the sea. Most of those began by exiting the Bosphorus and then moving to the east. So you come roughly north out of the Bosphorus, and then you turn to your right. And that's why many of the earliest settlements that we know about on the Black Sea, from people we would now call Greeks or Mediterranean Greeks, were dotted around that coastal area. Some of the periphery later on go to the west and begin sort of settling the territory around the western coast of the Black Sea. But that depends on probably better sailing technology and the ability to move back and forth against prevailing winds. The ancient Greeks used to say that it was possible on a ship in the middle of the sea to see both shores at once. So the Black Sea is a relatively diminutive place in the world of seas and oceans. I've always been skeptical about that. I thought that was a kind of old salt's tale, but then I have had people write to me after having read my skeptical account in the book and saying, well, if the conditions were right and you were standing on top of a mast, and so I've had a couple of seafarers sort of calculate that it might just be possible on a perfectly clear day if you were high enough on a ship. But most of the time, people didn't sail right across, because in fact there are two prevailing sets of currents that move against each other in this way right at the center of the sea. So you wouldn't go from the Bosphorus, say, all the way across the Black Sea, but the thing you could do is go relatively easily from Crimea to the point in the south, which is Sinope. So the point of the sea that's really the narrowest between Crimea and the southern coast was a distance that could be traversed relatively easily, and we know that ancient Greeks probably did that. But as in most bodies of water, people did not want to just take off and sail out of sight of land. Not only because it was dangerous to do so, you get caught in a storm, and you could lose everything, but also because you had plenty of stuff to do along the coast. You would pick up some items here, sail down the coast and sell them, pick up some more items, sail down the coast. So it's what historians call the coasting trade was the dominant way in which people got around. If I could say one more thing about that, the intriguing thing about the Black Sea, and you may have heard this from your environmental historian, is that below about 200 meters, it's entirely dead. So it's anoxic below 200 meters, which means that anything that requires oxygen can't live. So, fish, and any other forms of life that require it, certain types of bacteria and so on. What that means, though, magnificently, is that below that line, you also don't have the kind of wood-eating bacteria that destroy sunken ships. So in theory, every single ship that ever sank in the history of humanity in the Black Sea at depth is still there. And there's been some very good underwater archaeology that's been done that has shown Byzantine era ships with their rigging, with the rope rigging still on them. It's really quite magnificent. Well, the major stuff so far, has really been finding, intact Byzantine era ships. Knowledge, there's not been a magnificent treasure. I mean, you find amphora all over the place, sort of things from the Greek and Roman periods, but I don't know of a treasure hoard that's been found yet. In ancient Rome, one of the delicacies was a form of what we might now call anchovy paste that was created along the Black Sea coast. A bird that was indigenous to the region along the Phasis River in what is today Georgia became very well known in ancient Rome, and we get the word for that bird from the region. It's called a pheasant from the Phasis River. So, this was well known as a source of exotic delicacies to ancient Greeks and Romans, and then to people who lived along the coast and were engaged in both the coastal trade as well as fishing. It was a dominant source of protein for many people around the coast. It's just what happens, I think, over time, and this is true in the Mediterranean to a degree as well. The land, in the age of nationalism, the land wins out. Because it is interesting that in our period right now, none of the cities along the coast of the Black Sea became national capitals. The national capitals are all pushed inland. Bucharest and Sofia and Ankara and Tbilisi, they're all pushed very far inland. And to a degree, that's not an accident, because I think, when people take decisions about where you site national capitals, you want places that obviously are easily defended and are connected by transport links with other parts of the country, but you also want a place that's yours and that can be defined as yours. And the sea, almost by definition, causes us to think not in exclusive us and them terms. It's a place that's all about movement and coming and going and shipping and trade and exchange with people who aren't like you. And in an age of nationalism, that's a dangerous idea. Over the last 200 years or so, as you have the consolidation of political power on the land, both north and south, into two great imperial powers, the Ottomans, of course, in the south and the Russian Empire in the north, the geopolitics of this region is very much defined by the struggle for power between those two imperial systems. And what that means on the sea is the struggle for dominance on the sea. The Ottomans, after 1453, after they conquer Constantinople, and then over the next century extend their control all along the north coast of the sea and into Balkans, they are able to control shipping into and out of the sea. Some historians will say that this was began the era of the Black Sea as a kind of Turkish lake for about 2 centuries after 1453. I think what in fact happens is that the Ottomans, they certainly don't turn it into a Turkish lake. For a good part of that period, they subcontract trade on the Black Sea to the same people who were doing it for the previous 2 or 3 centuries before, and that's primarily Italians. If anything, after 1453, for a century or so, the sea becomes very much a Genoese lake, and it's the Genoese who are ruling from their center in Constantinople, ruling very much a trade empire on the sea. It's not until the very end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, with the rise of the Russian Empire, the pushing of the Russian Empire south, Peter the Great's first forays on the Black Sea, and then most spectacularly by the second half of the 18th century, the forays of Catherine the Great on the Black Sea, that you begin to have then major contests between Ottomans and Russians for control. And that's why it's at exactly the same time that Catherine begins to establish a set of forts and cities from Odessa to Sevastopol that become the dominant players in Russian geopolitics across the sea for the next 2 centuries. This is a book that covers about 8,000 years, so you can't do archival work on every period in a book that's of this sweep. But I did for the book a lot of research in archives around the region, also archives sort of abroad. So the British National Archives, for example, because of Britain's strong interest in the naval history of the Black Sea and naval powers on the Black Sea, Britain's role in the Crimean War, for example. So some of the archival sources there were very important. It's also the case that Britain had consuls in the 19th century all along the Black Sea, and those consular reports are incredibly interesting because the consuls are writing about trade and local politics and the fisheries and all sorts of things that would have been of interest to in an international setting, and those ended up being rather important in the way that I interpreted the history of the region. The other set of sources are travelers' tales, all the way from Herodotus in the 5th century BC, who is in fact our first major traveler on the Black Sea and tells all sorts of fantastic stories, of course, literally fantasies about the region. He may never have gone there himself. He may just have been recording things that he heard from people who had been there, all the way up through the 18th and 19th centuries, or I should say in the Renaissance, where you have plenty of Genoese, Venetian, Florentine travelers moving back and forth across the sea. Some of our best maps of the period are actually these things called portolans, which are sailing charts that were created by Italian sailors in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. And they're really beautiful, almost works of art, and incredibly accurate. The amazing thing is, if you look at those, say, a 15th century sailing chart of the Black Sea, you will not have an accurate map after that again for about 300 years between those sort of two periods, meaning that we knew more about the Black Sea in the 14th century than we knew in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. Not until you get professional scientific mapping in the second half of the 18th century, when Catherine the Great and Russian cartographers begin to move down. It's not until we relearn the sea. And that, in a way, is another one of the great themes of the book, is that, you know, we might think of the Black Sea in that part of Eastern Europe as the far edge of Europe. You know, that's the far edge, unknown bit of Europe. But if you look at the long stretch of human history, the relationship between the Black Sea and Europe has been a long sine wave. Meaning, at some points, this sea is thought of as fundamentally a part of Europe and deeply connected to Europe. You know, in Marco Polo's day, you could travel to the Black Sea and meet somebody you knew, meet a trading partner, meet a family member who happened to be living there. And then you move into a long period of disconnection from Europe, where people tell strange fantasy stories about what goes on there. And then the 18th century begins to pick up again, and the rise of the grain trade, the founding of cities like Odessa, connects this part of the region to Europe again. Then you have the Cold War, where this is the far extreme unknown bit of Europe. And, you know, now maybe we're back in a moment where the Black Sea is connected with Europe in a way that we haven't seen for more than half a century. One of the things that is interesting about the entire Black Sea region is that people are far more likely to know the history of a culture or a society or a country that is hundreds or thousands of miles away than they are likely to know the history of their next door neighbor. So if you were to ask Ukrainians to, you know, tell me 5 things you know about Bulgarian history, probably very little, right? You ask, well, tell me 5 things you know about Georgian history. Really very, very little at all. And this is not, again, it's not that unusual, right? You, apart from Cinco de Mayo, if you ask most Americans to tell you something about the history of Mexico, they would tell you they would really not know much at all, or Canada for that matter. So it is typically the case that we know distant cultures and societies more than we know that of our neighbors. But in a region that has been so interconnected, so interdependent for so much of human history, that's a rather strange outcome. And it's perhaps a further testament to how tall and thick the walls we have built around the histories that we tell, the way in which we tell these sort of segmented national histories rather than thinking more broadly and more regionally. Here is one. Let me give you the only known law of human history, and I just made it up, but it's the only known law of human history, and that is this, that the supply of history in every part of the world is precisely the same. So by that I mean that, you know, so Americans go to London, let's say, and Americans will sort of say, oh my God, I loved London, and I love Rome, or I love Berlin. There's just so much history here, which is not a silly thing to say, right? Everybody says that. But if you stop to think about it a moment, well, actually every part of the world has precisely the same amount of history, because every part of the world has been moving through historical time at exactly the same rate. It's just that in the way we have thought of the units of history, that is the thing that into which history congeals, we have certain biases. So we have a sedentary bias. That is, we like to tell the history of places and people who stay put, who stay in one place, which means that the histories of nomadic peoples nomadic Native American populations or Mongols or others in other parts of the world, people who move around don't get told in the same kind of way. We have a landlubber bias that I mentioned before. We like things that happen on dry land and are less comfortable with things that happen over seascapes, let's say, or on rivers, or, even though there's a lot of activity that happens on lakes, rivers, and seas, that we're not that good at telling about. And then, of course, there's the bias that has to do with gender or ethnicity or you name it, where we pick a unit that we think is the engine of history and then tell that story. And so what I wanted to do here was to try to break that down a little bit and simply say, would we think of the past in a different way? Would we think of the nodal points in history in a slightly different way? So here's another thing is that, if you ask Ukrainians, Romanians, Bulgarians, Turks, Georgians, and Russians to give me a chronology of, the last 200 years, well, Russians would talk about the liberation of the serfs, and then they would talk about, reform movements at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. They would talk about the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War, and then you talk about Stalin, and, you go through this sort of chronology. The Georgians would talk about that period from 1918 to 21 or so when they were an independent country, and then they would talk about Stalinism, and then finally the story gets to liberation in 1991 and the creation of an independent Georgian state. Romanians, Bulgarians would have similar kinds of things. But nobody really experienced history in exactly that way, right? That chronology is a thing that we later on, so a wonderful historian of Eurasia named Stephen Kotkin once said that, the only reason in Russian history we think there was a thing called the provisional government, in the summer of 1917, is because it produced a lot of paper. And that's true. They produced a lot of documents. But did anybody really know, really believe they were governed by a thing called the provisional government in Kerensky? Well, probably not. So the contention is that around the Black Sea and lots of other landscapes, you have to put aside, not reject, but at least put aside for a moment all of those competing chronologies, so where you somehow imagine that, well, you step one step over the borderline from Bulgaria to Romania, and you're suddenly in a different chronology and a different history. Well, it doesn't work that way. And to try to tell human stories from the perspective of those who experience. I love reading travelers' accounts, not because you want to believe everything that some French or Italian traveler said about a region, but because it does provide a window into the way they were thinking about things. I also really enjoy looking at guidebooks, like historical guidebooks, because a guidebook, whether it's a tourist guidebook or there's a wonderful one from the Renaissance era called the Practice of Commerce, which is an Italian guidebook, literally a guidebook from the Renaissance to doing business on the Black Sea, and includes very helpful advice, like you might want to grow your beard because a lot of people around here have beards, and you'll blend in a little better. But these are incredible little documents because they provide a window into a time that is very different from our own and a way of thinking that is very different from our own. It's not that people didn't recognize difference in that era. Of course they recognize that this person is different from that person. You're part of a different community from the one I'm part of. But it's just that those lines of difference were not the same as are meaningful to us today. So, for example, in the Black Sea in the 14th or 15th century, say, the distinction between being Genoese and Venetian was huge, right? That was a huge distinction because these were the two great rival powers for commerce. They fought battles on the Dardanelles, Venetian ships versus Genoese ships. And but we've lost that distinction now because, of course, we think of them as all Italians. And it provides this entree into just a different set of conceptions about what we think natural human communities are. I think of myself as somewhere between a historian and a social scientist, I guess. I mean, I'm interested in contemporary events. I'm interested in kind of theories about how we think about human communities and social interactions on the social science side, but I'm also interested in the past, and I'm interested in stories from the past and imaginations of the past. And it seems to me that one of the tasks of history writing is not just to get some version of truth, which I think historians should be. They should be true to their sources. They shouldn't claim more than they think their sources reveal. But at the same time, history writing is, to me, an exercise in the moral imagination. That if you can cast your mind back to the way a set of people whom you can never meet because they happen to be dead, a set of people you can never meet lived their lives and made sense of their lives and created meaning out of their lives. If you can do that through history, then that's a kind of exercising a set of muscles that you can apply now. That if you can do it with people you can never meet, how much easier must it be with people whom you can meet, neighbors you're surrounded with right at the moment. So history has a kind of moral core to it, but the moral is not telling the one true story that all historians are getting at. It's exercising your capacity to imagine the lives of other people. Super. Thanks very much for doing this. I really enjoyed it.